I would introduce him as if he was somebody who needed an introduction, but of course he doesn't. Dr. Gurmai Nagash, of course, is our esteemed professor of Eritrean and African studies here at Ohio University, and English and African literature, and I would like him to introduce our guest. So, Dr. Nagash.
So, thank you, Steve, and thank you so much, students and faculty, for being present in this lecture. This lecture by Alemseghed is sponsored by the African Studies Program as you may have guessed, and I would like to thank Steve Howard, Steve Howard, the Director of African Studies. He really made this possible by acting in a very steady and generous manner. He, I think, only knows what I'm talking about here. And my thanks also go to Dr. Ismail Al-Mahdi, who is Associate Director of African Studies, and of course, Dr. Shani Koi, Assistant Director of African Studies, and David Conrad have been really very instrumental in organizing these lectures and logistics and the publications for this lecture. I also would like to extend my gratitude to Joe Lenosa, a PhD candidate of history, despite his very busy schedule, writing his comps this week. He succeeded with flying color final job. For his engagement and time is Alemseged Tesfai. Alemseged Tesfai lives in Asmara in Eritrea, and he is head of the National History Project in Eritrea's Research and Documentation Center in Asmara. Previously, he held positions in the management of Ethiopian Airlines. It's a long list, and worked as a legal expert in the Ministry of Finance in Addis Ababa. After studying in the United States at the Universities of Illinois and Wisconsin, that was in the 1970s, he moved to Eritrea and served his country in different capacities really for several years as head of curriculum, historian, school director, researcher, as a literary and writer, as a journalist and editor of a newspaper and a radio station. This is all during the years of the Eritrean independence struggle, and this happens in the occupied and semi-liberated parts of the country. As I mentioned, for the last 13 years, he has led Eritrea's history project in the Research and Documentation Center of Eritrea. He is the author of several books and numerous articles really. Just to mention a few of them, in 1983 he wrote a very interesting monograph on the development and role of literature in the revolution. 1984, a novel called The Hadara. 1985, Drama as a critical analysis. 1987, The British Administration in Eritrea. It goes on and on. Another novel in 1997. 1997, again, a book on development, African development, which he co-authored with Martin Dorombos, a professor from the Netherlands, my previous country. He also is a translator of Boatiango's I Will Marry When I Want into Tigrinya. He wrote a book called 2 Weeks in the Trench, Reminiscences of Childhood and War in Eritrea. Another children's book, Gitano. 3 huge books. One is coming up. This is volume 1 and this is volume 2, and he's working on another volume on the history of Eritrea. Some of his writings have been translated into Arabic and English. He is widely read in the Middle East, Europe, and the United States. If you mention the name of Alemseged Tesfai in Eritrea, people will talk about the depth and fairness, and also linguistic place. This is also a little bit, this is an academic university event, but it's also a little bit of personal, emotional event for me. I am very, very happy to have him here. I have worked on with him for several years. Actually, a chapter of my PhD work was dedicated to him. I continue to write about him. And every time I read his work and speak with him, I really continue to learn a lot from him. And also, not only in terms of his research on Eritrean history and culture, but the way his work really speaks to the wider challenges of post-colonial African societies as they move, negotiate, if you will, the transition from tradition to modernity. You see this area of language, the area of education, the area of political governance, economics, power, memory, and of course historical information, which there's a lot about. And this week has not been a different subject, so thank you so much for coming. In this presentation, this lecture, he will speak under the title Writing Eritrean-African History from an Insider's Perspective, and we'll have a Q&A session.
Thank you. What do I call it? Very much. Good morning. Thank you very much for this elaborate introduction. I would also like to thank Professor Howard and Professor Guma this time for making this possible. Not only this lecture here tonight, this evening, but also for making it easier for me to come from Eritrea. Getting a visa to the United States these days it takes some doing, and part of that doing was done by my friends here, so thank you very much. It's also great to be in the U.S. campus after 40 years, I think it is. Yesterday I was reading the campus paper, I believe, where the editorial says, remembers the Penn State killings of 40 years ago. I said, has it been that long? That's when I came over from my country to the United States to study in the University of Illinois. And those were embroiled times. Those were different from what I see now. Those were times that were embroiled in conflict. If you think America is divided today, forget it. The divisions of those days were quite enormous as far as I could see and examine. And the technology has gone way forward. When I was there, when I was leaving the United States in 1974, there certainly was no laptop computer, no PC for that matter. The only computer that I came across was at the University of Illinois, where I took a course in statistics. And this was a long test, what do you call this? A cardboard baby, where you punched some whatever, fed it on one side, and it screeched and crunched and it went to the other side, and then you it's no longer, that doesn't exist now, probably in the Smithsonian Institute. Even the video deck was a new invention when I left the United States. I didn't get to see a video movie here in the United States. I saw it not in Africa. So, the advancement has been quite tremendous. And I'm very happy to be here in Athens. It's different, it's green. I've come, and I know I've come at an opportune time. It's so green. I can't believe I'm leaving. I want to come back in some form. I was watching through my window this morning, and these two squirrels chasing each other. I asked God if there is this thing called incarnation, bring me back, even as a spirit.
Hopefully before that.
So let me, that's by way of an introduction. I'm going to be very informal in this presentation. Speak for about half an hour, and then you can ask me as many questions as possible can, and I will try to answer them as coherently as I possibly can. How did I get into history? Is the first question that I would like to answer. Into history writing. I was trained to be a lawyer. Ironically, it's the United States that put me into history of Eritrea. Because when I was writing my thesis in the University of Illinois, I chose the topic. The topic was the role of the four great powers and the United Nations in the federation between Eritrea and Ethiopia. I was looking into the legality or the illegality of that particular form of union between these two countries as effected by the United Nations. Let me briefly also tell you a brief history of Eritrea for those of you who don't know where it is or what it is. East Africa, it's a neighbor of Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, not Somalia, Djibouti, and the Red Sea. In 1890, it came under the rule of the Italians. The Italians declared Eritrea calling it 1890. In 1941, as part of the Second World War, the British kicked out the Italians and they occupied it for about 10 years. During that time, the question of its future arose, along with the question of former Italian colonies, like Somalia and Libya. And because the Eritreans did not agree amongst themselves as to what their future should be, the United Nations took over that issue and, without consulting the people of Eritrea, decided on a federation with Ethiopia. Not the kind of federation that you know here in the United States. It was the federation was to be an umbrella, but the umbrella was to be the Ethiopian government, and Eritrea was to just be appended to that major, bigger state called Ethiopia. And there was no avenue for Eritrea to complain about how it would be treated, to divorce himself from that union. Nothing of the sort was done. So 10 years later, the Ethiopians abrogated the federal arrangement and annexed Eritrea, and neither the United Nations nor the United States, which sponsored the Federal Act, nor any one of those great powers paid any heed to it. But by that time, the Eritreans had objected politically, and since nobody heard that, when they started the armed struggle in 1961, and it took Eritrea 30 years of very, very bitter struggle to obtain its independence. This is briefly the history. How did I get into history writing now? When I was dealing with the legality, as I said, of this federal arrangement that I just described, I found one thing. I found that all the material that the United Nations had used in coming to that decision was material that they themselves, the Western powers, had collected over the years. There were Italian materials, there were British materials, American materials, very few Arabic material sources that I don't think they ever looked deeply into. And so on, German maybe. And what hit me when I was doing this research was the paucity, the total, almost the total absence of an indigenous history told from the indigenous point of view of Eritrea. I found that Eritreans had been acting their history, acting it out, probably talking about it, passing it from generation to generation orally, but never committing it to writing. And this hit me, really hit me, out there in Champaign, Illinois. So I had to do with, as the United Nations, did, I had to do with all these Western or foreign sources in arguing against the decision of the United Nations. I don't know how it reads now. I mean, it's there. It's a big document there. I never quite read it, if you look at it much. But that stayed in my conscience, that Eritrea never had a written history of its own. And this had a reason. One reason being the Italians, having occupied Eritrea for 60 years, had not allowed Eritreans to write in their own languages, or even to write in the Italian language, not much. they had not allowed them any form of political participation or political organization. Italy was different in this sense. So as far as colonialism was concerned, Italian colonialism was different from British and French colonialism, because the British and French did allow a measure of education, did allow freedom of expression, did allow the existence and the publications of local newspapers where people could express themselves on all and every issue. The Italians didn't do that. As a matter of fact, Italian policy directed that native education should not pass the 4th grade. 1, 2, 3, 4. And even then, what they could study was, 1, the 4 mathematical tables, division, subtraction, addition, and multiplication. Of science, some hygiene, so the Eritreans would be clean when they approach. That was it. So the 4 or 5 things that they allowed. Number 3 was enough Italian to make themselves understood to Italians. Just enough. Come stai, bene, io vado, tu vieni, io bevo. Things like that. And of history, they said they should know only the names of the personalities that made Italy great. That was what was allowed in school in Eritrea. No newspapers ever existed in any of the languages, Arabic or whatever. And when they did allow some schools to operate in native languages, mainly Arabic and Tigrinya, Tigrinya being one of the languages of Eritrea. When they did allow that also, then they did it within the confines of those directives that I told you about. It should pass beyond the 4th grade. So this did not allow really the culture of writing and the culture of reading to develop within Eritrea. And this partly, of course, explains why Eritreans did not have or could not write their own history when the need arose. And so this had its own consequences. When the time came for Eritreans to discuss their future, Ethiopia immediately claimed Eritrea as a long-lost province that had to come back to the fold. Actually, it claimed not only Eritrea, but it claimed Eritrea and Somalia as long-lost provinces that should come back to the Ethiopian fold. Ethiopia was then an empire. I'm sure maybe some of you have heard of Emperor Haile Selassie. Emperor Haile Selassie was a big emperor. Emperor Haile Selassie had been attacked by Italy in 1935. He had gone to the League of Nations to appeal to that world body because Ethiopia had been, from the beginning, also a member of the League of Nations, which preceded the United Nations. He had gone there and appealed in front of the world body, and the world body had ignored his pleas. And therefore, when he came back, when the British reinstalled him to his throne, he always used this little conscience-pricking thing done to him by the international community, and always made the international community feel a little guilty. So he was this big man. He had a personality. He was an emperor, and he acted like an emperor. One of the last of his kind when he died in 1975. So the Ethiopians, through Haile Selassie's prestige, and through the use of their court scribes, palace scribes, and through the employment of European, British, French, Italian, Swedish historians or researchers, have impressed upon the world that Eritrea was its long-lost province. They have written history of Eritrea, the Ethiopian history of Eritrea, arguments, you name it, they had. And there was an Eritrea that wanted its independence. The majority of its people wanted their independence, but without a written history, a coherent written history that they could sell to the international community. History sometimes can be sold, as many of you historians here know, history is sometimes like a commodity. You sell it. You can sell history. I mean, by selling, I don't mean money, but you can sell it, you can make it acceptable. However, here in the United States, you have a history that you teach kids from early on. I mean, I have little grandnieces in Albuquerque, where I'm staying with my brother's family. And they come and tell me all sorts of stories about America, history. They told me, we Americans, they are Eritrean by birth and so on, but they are Americans first. They know everything, you know, so many things that is there, deep in their psyche now. But they will grow up. George Washington cutting that tree and telling his father that he had cut that tree. That he was a very honest man. Abraham Lincoln was always cutting those logs of trees, a very quiet man and so on and so forth. All these stories are told to them as, and it's inculcated, deep in their psyche. It's there. We didn't have that kind of history. We told some things, we forgot some others, but we acted out our history without writing it down. And we paid very dearly for that. Because when it came to arguing our case in this world, what is our ancestors, our fathers and mothers, did not have the material to convince the world. The Ethiopians have the material to convince the world. And this, I think, is what stayed in my conscience, that why don't we have our own history? Why don't we tell our own history through our own languages? And language is, of course, a very important aspect of identity. Because if you don't tell your story through your own language, to your own people, convince your own people, then it's very difficult to maintain it. Or to at least inculcate throughout the nation the same kind of history that people should grow up with. This can be imagined stories. You know, sometimes nationalism is an imagined. Nations are imagined communities, is what Benedict says in this. I think it's correct. Nations are imagined communities. You cannot prove many things about the nation. It's a feeling. It's what you feel deep inside. It's what binds you together. And if what binds you together is not coherently put, such that children from their infancy, from their fairly young stages, do not grow up with it, then it becomes a very difficult thing to continue. In the case of Eritrea, we lost our independence partly because this could not happen. And people interpreted their sense and feeling of independence, of nationalism. Some thought the best way to protect Eritrean nationalism would be to join Ethiopia. They heard the Ethiopian version, they accepted the Ethiopian version, and they really fought for integration with Ethiopia. Only to regret it as soon as that integration came and fight against it. There were other parties, the mainly Muslim population, for example, wanted independence. But it was very hazy in their minds. So they established a Muslim league that seemed to only fight for independence for Muslims, regardless of what the Christians said or the Christians felt. These kinds of things divided the Eritrean population. Their interpretation of the notion of nationalism went many ways. Only later on, when the Ethiopian rule came and they started to suffer under the same yoke, only later on gathered together and fight against it enough to sustain for 30 years, and we ultimately reached it. So writing one's own language, history, in one's own language becomes a matter of national importance. Not only for the purpose of liberation, but even after liberation for the purpose of nation building. Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Excuse me. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is at the head, at the forefront of today of the fight. What did I? Happens. We passed 60 years and then we start. Ngugi wa Thiong'o is at the forefront of this more or less back to Africa language movement. He came to that conclusion after having written 3 novels in English. He started to think, decolonizing the mind. He had articulated that this practice of writing the colonial takes away oneself, push it into other selves, takes away your identity and implants the identity of others. Teach a child in English from the beginning, or in French, then with that language will come the culture, the thinking, the English and the French, or the Americans. That's one argument. First, writing in one language. Use that language. Because language is identity. Language is what expresses a person's internal feeling, culture, a psychological meaning. All these idioms, the proverbs, the stories, everything is what it is that makes people who they are. Is what it says. And then there are others, Chinua Achebe or jazz, of literature, great people. People like Chinua Achebe who say, well, language is language. It's fast. All this fuss about language. Language didn't come to me. I went where I chose the English language because it's there for anyone. And therefore, it's not what the language you use that's important. In fact, somewhere I read where he says that he used English language to infiltrate the ranks of the enemy, to destroy them from within. Well, I agree with Ngugi in this sense. Language is everything. Because I come from a country where the question of identity was fought to the finish. I don't think there is any other country in Africa where the issue of identity was fought on the political front, fought on the social front, fought on the economic front, and finally fought in the Alemseghed. I thought 50 years of 30 years of bitter fighting, and finally it was resolved through the government. I mean, let me bring it down to my own experience when I was maybe 12. My brother, who used to live in Addis Ababa, which is the capital city of Ethiopia, decided to take me with him. And, he was feeling lonely and so on and so forth. So he decided to take me with him from Asmara to Addis Ababa. And I went there at the age of 12. And unfortunately for me, I went there in the month of April. I was a 7th grader, and I was put in a school called Marili Secondary School in the month of April. And a month later, there was the finals, the exams. And I was made to sit in one of these exams, and it was an Amharic exam. Amharic is the language of Ethiopians. Tigrinya is the language spoken in Eritrea and also spoken across the border in Ethiopia too. So I looked at this exam, the questions, and I couldn't make head or feet out of it. I could not understand what they were saying, so I just sat there. And my teacher was doing that, and the invigilator was looking at me. He called me up, and he said, "Why aren't you writing?" I said, "Because I don't know Amharic." So what do you propose to do? I don't know, send me to the director. I was sure. So he said to me, no, just write your name there and give me the papers. And I said, no, if I give you the papers, sign them, then I'm going to get a zero, you know. So I refused. He said, okay. Sent it to the director, I went, the assistant director, he was an Egyptian. I even remember his name. His name was Dimitri Zaki. And he was sitting with my biology teacher, his name was Mr. Said. A very burly, pleasant man. Who would you talk to sometimes? To browse, you know, to sit down and fall asleep. Very nice. You must be there by now. You must have passed. So I went in there. The director said, and what are you doing in the middle of exams? I said, I can't do this. He said, why? Because I can't do it. He said, I'm hurried. So what? Aren't you supposed to know I'm hurried? I said, no. Why? Because I'm an elite. Because I said, no. And he said, aren't you Ethiopian? I said, no, I'm not Ethiopian. That was something that could not be uttered in Ethiopia. Because the federation between Eritrea and Ethiopia was known only in Eritrea. In Ethiopia, they had made sure, the Haile Selassie government had made sure that the word federation would not be mentioned in any of their official statements. They just said, oh, Eritrea has come back to full, Eritrea is united with Ethiopia. That's it. For 10 years, that's the propaganda they kept. And for 10 years, that's what people in Ethiopia believe. And even today, people in Ethiopia believe. And Eritrea had come to the fore, and then these rebels, these rebels had rebelled and taking it us, you know, split it apart. That's what they believe in. So I said, no, I'm not an Ethiopian. What are you? I said, I'm an Eritrean. So Mr. Said, nice gentleman, said, oh, if he is Eritrean, exempt him, why are you giving him hard time, you know, just leave him alone. And this was a time during the Suez crisis of 1956, it was only a year or so later. And Ethiopia and Egypt, Haile Selassie and Gamal Abdel Nasser, as he was called, were at loggerheads. And therefore, Mr. Said was getting a kick out of it. So he said, exempted, I was exempted for that year. So I went home, and this director called my brother and said, look, your little brother is going to plunge into trouble because he's going around telling people he's not in Ethiopia, he's in Eritrea. So my brother came to the house and said, why did you say this? I said, why not? What did you say? I said, why not? He said, you never uttered the word again outside of this house. I said, tell me, are we Eritreans? He said, yeah. Then what? In Addis Ababa, we are Ethiopians. Okay, let me put it this way, he told me, I'll never forget that. He said, in your heart, you are an Eritrean, but don't ever let it. So this was how we were growing. We were speaking Tigrinya. And Tigrinya, for those of us who spoke Tigrinya, 9 languages are spoken in Eritrea, Arabic. The conflict between the Ethiopian identity imposed by Eritreans and the Eritrean identity felt deep inside Eritrea was what brought about this war of independence, which in 1991 Eritreans won. And so that's why I agree with people who are the author that writing in one's indigenous language is a matter of identity also. A matter of maintaining that identity. I can write in English, and I'll probably get more credits for it, you know, you get known everywhere, etc. But then you leave a population there that's in need of reading material in its own language, be it literary or historical. And you more or less condemn them to a state of ignorance. But then there's one thing also that I agree with Achebe on. You know Achebe, strangely, but remarkably correct, because I think recently has learned it. Chinua Achebe refused to have his book for a long time. Things were translated into Union Igbo. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I understand. Because he thought Union Igbo was not a language that had grammatical finesse or elegance. Union Igbo having been put together during the British period by speakers of 4, 5, 6 dialects, and you know, we call it a hodgepodge language. And he is wary about translating his books into that language, although he has related. I say a point there. When I write in Tigrinya is not a standardized language. There is no standardization in the Tigrinya language. You have no problem in America. So that's just open the computer, there's a spelling mistake, text. Write it this way. It even differentiates between English, American English, Australian English, or Kenyan English. So that kind of a standardization doesn't exist. So sometimes we write as we pronounce it ourselves. I write, if the 4 or 5 of us here, I see some Eritreans here, we're asked to write two sentences, we'll probably write certain words differently. But just because there is no standardization in the language doesn't mean that we should write in those languages. I think they should be given a chance. Academies, language academies should be developed. We have a problem in Eritrea. In Eritrea, education is given in the mother tongue. There's 9 languages, and I think 8 languages are now in operation. Schools, elementary schools, are taught in the mother tongue in Eritrea. Tigrinya, Arabic, Saho we learn in these 8 languages. Curricula has been developed to each language, and children who start school are taught in their mother tongue, and the advantage is very clear that they understand what is taught them very clearly, rather than being taught Tigrinya or Arabic or English and then being told to understand complex topics in those languages. They are given their lesson, their education in their own. But the problem is the mother tongue continues only after 5th grade, including Tigrinya, which is supposed to be more developed. After the 5th grade, it stops. English becomes the primary language, with Arabic given in some schools as a second language. And so the child is now being cut off from the mother tongue, 5th grade, and they don't go back to it forever, more or less. Unless, of course, in work or wherever, because the Tigrinya is becoming more or less like the official language without being announced. So people are sometimes forced by circumstances to learn Tigrinya. And so this is becoming a major problem. As far as the leadership in Eritrea is concerned, it's being restricted. That's one problem. Another problem would be, can one maintain the equality of languages in a situation like this? With some of the languages developing fast and other languages staying behind, and this becomes also a political issue. And so for a writer like myself who writes in Tigrinya, Tigrinya is becoming, through our efforts, Tigrinya is becoming a highly developed language in comparison with the other languages that are lagging behind. And this is creating some political problems. So this is, I think, in a nutshell, what I wanted to write. I don't want to go on and do more details. This is what I wanted to say in a very informal manner, and I would be very happy to respond to questions. I think we can elaborate more with the history of it. Thank you.
Hey, I'm very aware of a long tradition that I was associated with Ethiopia of religious literature, Indigenous and other texts. Is any of that literature associated with monasteries and so forth in Eritrea?
Good.
Well, the early biblical texts. Whatever.
Well, let me explain first what Giz is. Giz is the old language of both Eritrean, Tigrinya speakers, and Amharic speakers in Ethiopia. It's the old, like Latin was the language of the Italians and the French and the Spanish. So Giz was the language of the Amharic of Tigrinya speakers. And Giz is an ancient language with an ancient script, which has the only name I know is this. This would be So this is an old language that gave birth to several languages, mainly the Amharic from Ethiopia and Tigrinya of Tigray in Ethiopia and Tigrinya in Eritrea. At a certain point of history, I don't know, maybe the night can help me here, Giz started to give way to these other languages. But it was confined, itself it was confined in the church. And the Coptic Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church, and the Catholic Church use the Giz script and the Giz language in their rites and in their prayers and whatever. They still use this in church. Nowadays, people are starting to break from this and give sermons in Tigrinya, but otherwise, my mother used to go to church, and the whole ceremony was in Giz, and she had no notion what on earth the priests were saying, but she was this pious woman who wept sometimes at their worship. She understood it, dealt with the Virgin Mary and God and Saint Michael and all these patron saints that she believed in, and that's it. But nowadays they are breaking from that tradition and using other languages like the Tigrinya, for example, in these churches. But the churches in Ethiopia and still use Giz. As the means of communication within the church.
Monastery or
if you're familiar with the 9 saints, the 9 saints who came and some of them Syrians, some of them whatever, who came in the whatever century, 7th century or whatever, and spread Christianity beyond what it had, beyond the confines that it was limited to earlier. They established these monasteries, and some of them are Filipos in Bizarre and others. There are some 5, 6, 7 that I can think of now, with ancient scripts and scriptures, parchments. By the way, Christianity came into Eritrea into Eritrea and Ethiopia in 365 AD. So we became Christians long before Europe. Yeah. And Islam came into Eritrea when Muhammad himself was still alive. in the 7th century. There were some of his followers who had been persecuted, and because he wanted them to escape persecution, he recommended that they go to Ethiopia, it was called the land of the Habesh, where a king, a benevolent king, would accept them, and that's what they did. So Islam came into through Eritrea, of course, through the Red Sea into Ethiopia in the 6th century, in the 3rd, in the 7th century.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yeah, appreciate it. But one of my questions is, as you highlighted, there are so many more ethnic communities not only in Eritrea but all over other parts of Africa. And I'd be advocating for writing in our mother tongues and other areas. Now, how do we get across the point maybe you write in Tigrinya to the point maybe a kid who grows up speaking Arabic who doesn't necessarily understand Tigrinya? How do we get that practicality of being able to translate or having those things be read? You people like yourself and people like me, which if I ever get to that point, right? To people like that, because even we are all part of the same collective at the end of the day. So how do we reach that gap, that barrier without writing in English? And then one of my other question is also, since you have been, can you give us some more highlights and experiences of the practicalities of combining academic ideals to the real world, how some of the obstacles you had to work on?
Can you repeat the second question?
We did, let's probably just answer the first one.
He needs help with this.
No, the question that I understood is how do you translate from one language to the other? Well, that's always a problem. That's also the problem that moving at the moment faces. The best thing is when you find translators who speak the two languages well. In Eritrea, we don't have it. These two books have been translated into a language called Tigray. Tigray is another language in Eritrea. Related, similar, also as language gave birth to Tigray, which is close. Tigray and Amharic. That's the biggest language. So, in this case, university graduates who speak Tigrinya very well, because they studied it or maybe because they grew up in essentially Tigrinya-speaking areas, were able to translate this into Tigray. And therefore, for them, that task was very, very easy. Translating within languages that one understands very well is very easy. It took me, because I speak English and I can write English, I don't think it took me more than 2 months to translate this book here. Absolutely, no problem. And in the same way, there are people who can do this. Now, the mother tongue education is encouraging a lot of the speakers of those various minority languages to also learn Tigrinya. Because Tigrinya is now so widespread that people speak it. More people now speak Tigrinya than the other language, and Tigray too is also widespread. It cuts across Tigray. There are some languages that cut across linguistic differences.
So, my question is, if they are learning Tigrinya, wouldn't that be, like you said, Ngugi's point of transplanting a Tigrinya identity into the non-native speakers of Tigray, and how do you combat that, especially across Africa, where there's very essentially a standardized language?
I don't have a really good answer for that, because That's always going to happen. You have to come to some kind of an agreement, some kind of a national program that encompasses everybody. Otherwise, there is no end to these things. Absolutely. A national program that encompasses all, that treats everybody equally, treats not only the languages, but economically also. That has a balanced development program as far as all the regions is concerned and so on. That's how you, I think, combat this. But otherwise, this argument is always going to be there in a multilingual society. The United States is lucky because it's a melting pot. Everybody comes here and they melt. Well, they used to. I don't know.
Steve has a question.
Yeah, I get messages a lot on Facebook from people like Joe Bonosa asking me to take a quiz on how Eritrean I am. And that only goes as far as my enjoyment of Zigny, I'm afraid. It doesn't go much beyond that. But I do appreciate many aspects of the country and the people over. But listening to you about identity, which is such an important concern, what I get from what you were saying is defining, and I never heard this in an African context before, but defining what it means to be Eritrean through a sense of loss. That's what I was hearing you say. And I wondered if you could... A sense of loss.
Not having? I'm not sure I understood.
Well, that to define what it means to be Eritrean around what we've lost.
Yeah.
That's what I had a sense of as you were speaking, and I wondered if that was I hearing this right, or could you elaborate, or?
I'm not sure I'm speaking about this.
I think that the question is what makes Eritrean identity is kind of the search for an identity because it has been denied.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's the question.
Yeah, because it was a sense of loss. Yes. I mean, it's not even a loss, and I don't think it's a sense of loss in that sense because it's there. Eritrean nationalism was there inside. Otherwise, he can't just keep on fighting for 30, 40 years and sacrifice so many lives to win independence. It just doesn't come out of the blue, It was not a loss in the sense that it was not there and it had to come back from somewhere. It was there, but it was not recognized. It was a situation where not only Ethiopia but the international community said, you are Ethiopians for the right. No, and we said we are not Ethiopians. Just like what I told you, from the child's point of view, but then you magnify the national level, and that's what happened. That's what happened, because we were told time and again that we were Ethiopians, and we refused that. We refused to accept because not of any prejudice or hatred or jealousy or whatever the Ethiopians say. But we just didn't belong to it. I mean, we didn't feel part of it. Our imagined community was not Ethiopia. It was a country called, a funny-looking country called Eritrea, for which we fought tooth and nail, and alone also. So for quite a while to be independent. So yeah, in a sense, it was a sense of why aren't they recognizing what we feel? Why should we bow to the nations of others? I suppose.
Yeah, I have two questions. The first one is, how are people who are starting to learn language, the mother tongue, how are they doing compared to those who start to learn, like English or another language in the beginning? And the second question would be, how has your writing of Ethiopian history has contributed to better understanding of history in Ethiopia, and are your materials, your books used at the university or in schools?
The first question, how are they faring? I don't know. It all depends upon the school.
Because we have the same problem in my country when people, the government at a certain time, Canadians were helping kids learn their mother tongue first before they start learning French. But we didn't have the support of the government because ministers and presidents would not send their kids there because they think that it's a waste of time. So I guess you know what is the reason.
It all depends upon the school. Because if the school gives children a good background in the English language at the same time, which starts in the third grade. But for the first 2 years you study only the mother tongue, and then third grade English is introduced, and sometimes Arabic too is introduced, with Arabic teachers. So schools with good teachers, good background, give children a good dose of the English language. Once they reach the 5th grade, 6th grade, and so on. Because their understanding of the other subjects in the mother tongue helps them a lot. Because child just give him a lesson in his own tongue, he understands it better, or she understands it better. No. In certain schools, in other schools that where English is not strong, then you find that it's shaky. So it all depends on from school to school, from region to region. But overall, as I said earlier, because mother tongue education stops in the 5th grade, and because English takes over, and because mother tongue education does not continue to high school and in Ethiopia, for example, Amharic continues up to university. So people can read and write and Amharic. Perfect. That's not the case in Eritrea. And that's what people are discussing now. In my language, to his credit, tried to establish an Eritrean languages and literature section which was aimed at even creating an Eritrean languages academy which will have taken care of this. But we haven't reached that stage. It hasn't happened. And until then, I think this kind of progress that you mentioned is going to continue for sure. In a way, in some cases, it does have implications. Although the political ramifications and the educational benefits at the beginning, at that lower stage, are quite obvious. Your other question was about Ethiopia. What were we talking about Ethiopia?
Yeah, it was about how was your writing
affected the well, some Ethiopians are very angry. Some Ethiopians are very angry. I spoke in Penn State a few days ago, and there was a report of that talk in the local newspaper in the Schuylkill campus. And the review I have received from some of my Ethiopian friends is certainly not very flat. But I think serious students of the region are looking into this, especially now that it's been translated into Arabic. Very serious studies are being made of these two books. Conferences, and I couldn't go to Cairo a couple of weeks ago. There was an invitation where partly some of my books will be discussed. So it's picking up. It's picking up because this was written only in Tigrinya, it was confined to Tigrinya speakers in Ethiopia and Eritrea. And some Ethiopians may I have read a review of of this book by an Ethiopian scholar, which did fairly good review. But I think this has to be translated into English to reach a wider audience and to see if they will mean something. Because what the sources that I have used are different from those sources that other writers have been using before. I have used indigenous sources, newspapers, that were never to put these debates that were going on about the future of the advocacy for independence, but the Arabic sections of and interviews with elders who were active participants or observers of that period. And you find that what the British have been writing and doing, and what the Eritreans were expecting, they are making to others. That's what it means to write indigenous history in an indigenous language.
Professor Singh?
Yes. Thank you, sir, for very helpful thought. I take your point about writing the history of Eritrea from indigenous sources in order to, in a way, destabilize the notion of federation imposed by, British and Italian, powers. But I found your whole narrative kind of centered in nationalist discourses. And how do we kind of go beyond? I didn't hear any critique of the nationalist discourses, because nationalists, from Fanon onwards, there's a lot of critique of nationalist discourses. They have not always served us well in various parts. Think about Rwanda. So what is happening now with identity issues that cannot be fully housed in these nationalist discourses? What is, for example, happening with education in Eritrea? I don't know a lot. Maybe you can tell me more. My sense is that we don't have too many opportunities that were missing under the colonial structures. Even today, that the empowerment of students through education is still a huge challenge under the current Eritrean dispensation. So isn't that the danger to this valorization of nationalist discourses that I think I heard a lot in your talk?
Well, I was, of course, concentrating on the history of the 40s, 50s that I'm dealing with, and the language. Well, what's happening to education in Eritrea is today it's in a state of transition, confusion, whatever. Whose result we will not know for some time.
Are we still blaming the colonizers?
No.
I just wanted to make sure.
No, I'm not blaming the colonizers. That part this blaming, this imputing everything to colonizers has to stop at some point. At the beginning, maybe yes, but later on, of course, development programs that are designed by governments sometimes responsible also for what happens. The less created, the less left by colonizers is something else. But then when you try to rearrange that mess, then you also
Create a bigger
mistakes. And in Eritrea today, education is being revamped, completely revamped. The educational system is being revamped. It's being rearranged. Colleges that didn't exist before are being set up. It's a new experiment whose end I cannot possibly predict from where I stand. And it could create some problems. Maybe it could create some miracles, I don't know. But my view is that today it's in a state of transition and progress. I hope that answers that.
Part of the, if I may kind of proceed, is part of the question of Prophet Saksigi is when you kind of create a nationalist discourse, national history. Can this nationalist history also be critical of, say, discontents of the post-colonial state? So how do you negotiate with being critical of the post-colonial state with all its problems, as we know it's not only Eritrea but also across Africa? This is a very difficult question, actually, very complicated. There is a nationalist history, nationalist discourse, which aims kind of to correct, refute, to talk back to what happened to the injustices. But I think part of the question he's raising was, well, how do you deal with the new injustices? That is really the
Thank you. Thank you, Governor. Because I had a friend there who was being paid as a dean $1,500 a month, which is a lot of money in Eritrea, and who was at the university for 3 years, where there were no students being taught. And he finally left and went to India in frustration. And so I have, governments that have a lot of interest in controlling the populations, they don't go to the limits of closing down universities and colleges, and that seems to have happened in Eritrea. And so there are new scenarios getting enacted which are as bad or worse than what was happening under the colonialists. I'm trying to learn from you.
I mean, I can't really answer these questions in a nutshell. I mean, we can go and have a beer and we can...
last question.
That wouldn't solve any problems.
Well, first of all, thank you for being here. And I just had a question because you talked about identity, you talked about nationalism, and you talked about history. And I think about when I hear of Ethiopian and Eritrean history, I think about even within our own families, how a lot of families have been married and have kids, right? You have half Eritrean, half Ethiopian kids. Where do they fit? And it's kind of related because of the nationalism and identity, and also in history. Are they left to just, do they have to like be ripped apart, or what is your explanation?
You know, this is a phenomenon of the recent war. Very unfortunate. This modern war that has spoiled the relationship between Ethiopians and Eritreans. In spite of this contest of identity that put us into confrontation for a long time, we have gone back to our old nice buddy ways. We were going to Ethiopia, they were coming to Eritrea. Friendships were blooming, and the governments were in good terms. That's all. And then this border war came. And we go and suddenly the conflict between Ethiopians, especially between Tigray and crossing Eritrea, have become unnecessarily heated up. I think tempers have to cool down at some point. I think they will cool down at some point. It's as if sometimes from the Ethiopian side, it's as if to be an Eritrean is a crime and to be Ethiopian is a crime. Attitude has to stop. And it only stops if people-to-people relationships. Because if governments refuse to batch from extreme positions and refuse to come together with people that that's not happening. I think we need to change. Same as I would say that how do injustices in a situation like ours or in many African countries I think it's up to the people's level of consciousness. The people have to be able to realize that this is the situation and it's no way to go and they should rise. Or they should do something about it. And the problem in many African countries is that people want change. They hate the system. Then another system comes, but they are always not ready for that coming system. They don't even analyze what kind of system is coming to them. They don't await a system with their own demands. Hey, look, we want to be ruled in such and such a way, and together, and united. That doesn't happen.
But that's not true in other parts of Africa. So I don't think we should generalize. I mean, things in Ghana are not the same as in Eritrea, and things in South Africa are not the same in Eritrea. So, let's not, make it into the same situation everywhere. The situations are different, and they call for different responses.
The issue of identity and the issue of nationality, when you look at when people, there's a book, Me Against My Brother. A lot of parts, because of the history, because of colonization, they're fighting with each other, but in the past they have been intermarried their family. So, I mean, in that sense, I see a lot of division throughout the conflict. And that's why I have a big concern when it comes to even writing, like history itself. How do you integrate these groups? It's a lot of it. It's a major issue that needs to be addressed, whether it's within history books or in any type of writing.
I agree. One of the problems in the demarcation of the border is precisely this. It's an issue that Ethiopians are raising. They're saying, look, if we demarcate the border between Eritrea and Ethiopia as the International Court of Justice has demarcated, then we're going to split villages and relatives apart, and therefore it's not about it, which is not what the kind of things will happen and is rejected by the government. On the other hand, there are many other issues. Yeah, I agree that these issues have to be addressed. And as to generalizing, I'm not trying to generalize. I'm trying to say each nation has its own face. And it's the realization, as I said, of the people, of the state they are in, and the need to do something about it that decides about it. That's it.
Okay. I like this talk a lot, actually, because I've been thinking a lot about identity. I've been reading a lot about the creation of my country, how it became, to be called my country, what was taking place. And I used a little, an economic lens using cattle to do this. And what I'm coming up with basically is a company, like my country is actually a company. They have shares. Stock exchanges were created the moment, this new paradigm, came to that part of Africa. And the government just started floating shares for land and all that stuff. New companies were being built, dairy, beef, railway, and the government has got shares in almost everything, And at the end of the day, you find out that the government is a money-making entity. It's actually a big company. And, this is what I'm looking at, and this is what I'm discovering about my country, that it was actually established from an economic interest. And then today, you talk about that nationalistic feeling, I'm supposed to have this nationalistic feeling. And then when I'm reading the facts, it's just, it just doesn't click. It just does not click. This is a big company that has a lot of labor. And the labor is the people. You get a tax ID, and you have to work, you have to pay your taxes. But when you look at it at the end of the day, it's all a financial arrangement. And, this is what I'm understanding. And I don't think this is a phenomenon that you'll see everywhere in Africa. There are different things that are taking place, on the continent. And, I've been thinking about how we just generalize Africa, and just try and put this one psychology towards the entire continent. We're not looking specifically what is going on. What was going on here? What type of issues were going on? And, like you say, this is basically what reflects from, the people that inhabit in those areas. You see it from a psychological perspective, that, different experiments are going on, whether it's social, economic, religion, but not everything was done from the same, recipe book. A lot of different monsters have come out of it.
The big question, I think, for African studies scholars and students is, does it make actual cultural essence to talk about Africa and African nations? Okay, when we have over 1,000 languages, how many countries there are there? 54. The border shift and so on and so forth. I think we should, whenever I talk about the post-colonial experience or about Pan-Africanism, it is kind of ambivalent always. And I think it is a term of convenience, right? So you have to kind of conceptualize, put together something. And by the way, the idea of Africa or the idea of whatever Pan-Africans feeling that we should have, and including African studies, and we know this from our research, it was not invented by Africa. I mean, it's a very serious one. But at the same time, African nations, African countries, as we were saying, because of injustice, because of development, because of historical injustice, sometimes they have succeeded, sometimes they have not. I mean, your perception of your country as a company, that is really, this is the first time I hear about a nation being considered as a company.
That's what I'm getting from what I'm reading.
From what you are getting. Okay, we'll go for, I mean, this is just, we'll go for one last question maybe, right? Okay.
Well, it seems to me like a number of the comments here in the audience have been speaking toward different ways of making history and different ways of writing history. And I think a lot of people are touching on them. The nationalist paradigm is one important one, especially vis-a-vis the dominance of the other forms of making history, colonialist history. What Salam was talking about seems to me to also relate more to what I often hear called something like people's history. And I think when you've spoken about the ways in which you're gathering your materials seems to be a methodology that's more oriented towards people's history, rather than looking at either elite history or certain kinds of histories that are documented from more institutionalized forms. And I think we can also speak about things like women's history and gender history and all of those threads that probably go into making a really good storyteller. So, I'm not sure that, I doubt that probably there are that many conflicts among us in this room about what's important, but rather what we on occasion give emphasis to.
There's a couple more questions there.
Yeah, I was going to ask, can we say now that you are a gatekeeper for Eritrea? I mean, can we say that now that you are a gatekeeper in Eritrea, or other Eritreans, especially of those who were writing Eritrean history, how different are those views from your perspective?
I didn't quite get you.
Okay, other Eritreans abroad who do the same thing that you're doing, producing Eritrean history using other sources. And if there are, how different are they from your perspective?
Well, number one, I write in English, which is a major difference, because they're writing in English. They're using the same sources that others have been using. Namely, for example, we use entirely British documents, sometimes Italian. People like Alemseghed use very, what they write is for me, the argument, I think what I would say is genuine Eritrean history. But what's missing there is the local sources, the interviews, the newspaper articles, the documents of the Eritrean Assembly or the Eritrean Parliament, the records of the Eritrean government. So the history of Eritrea from the Indigenous point of view is not being included there. So that makes a difference in interpretation also.
I guess my question is sort of about interpretation, but more from your end as a finder of this history. In the current work that you do, oral testimonies, have you seen sort of discrepancies between different groups in Eritrea about talking about nationalism? Meaning, does a Djibouti talk about Eritrean history different than some? And how has that affected your own understanding about?
Yeah, not about this period.
Yeah.
When we talk about this period, they are more or less united in their analysis and their memories. Today, yes, as you can see, the websites, people are now interpreting Eritrean history in many different ways. The Djibouti, the Kunama, all the nationalities, even the nationalities are now having their own divisions. Regions of subdivisions. There are 45 or 46 political parties now. Some of them ethnic based, some of them are based in the diaspora, not in the Union, in the diaspora in the opposition. So today, yes, there are, you do see other interpretations of history, but I don't find it yet. But here, this was a period of discovery. This was a period of political struggle at its basic military stages. And the memory of this period is not at the variance among the various groups. There are some differences, of course, of treatment, and so on and so forth, during the Ethiopian regime, during the federal period, during the British, these kinds of things exist. But as far as the basic general movement of history is concerned, I don't really find much of a difference here. Today, yes, I'm not dealing with today, but today there's a lot of that kind of ground.
I'd like to take you back to the use of language and the search of identity. You've talked about Chinua Achebe and Professor Rigo Adiomo is using Kikuyu, which is one of the ethnic groupings in Kenya. But now the problem that I'm having with this is that Kikuyu is one of the groupings out of 64 other groups within Kenya. So my biggest question is, why doesn't he make use of Kiswahili, which is more universal, and all these groups can understand it? Now, if I relate it to yourself, I don't know whether Tigrinya is a national language, like Kiswahili in our context. And if it is well with me. If it is not, why are you not using the national language of Village? That matter.
You don't have a national language, so that's the problem. During the federal period, Arabic and Tigrinya were the national language. But with independence, this idea of the national language has been abolished. So we have equality of languages, as I said, in schools, everything is taught and so on. But de facto, in fact, it's Tigrinya that's now almost the working language of the government without being called a national language, at least taking the role of an official language. And that's what I was talking about earlier when I said this is creating some questions, some political questions, as to whether the idea of equality of languages is still working. There are lots of people who think that we should go back to the old federal formation of federal setup of making these two languages, the national language, and just make the other languages operable if the need arises. But otherwise, make Tigrinya and Arabic the national languages. There is a movement, there is an argument discussed within Eritrea and outside on this particular issue.
Okay, I think we should come to the